Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the Battle of Trafalgar, its relevance then in 1805, more than 200 years ago, and its relevance today. And I think today was Trafalgar Day from, was it yesterday? Anyways, yesterday or today was Trafalgar Day. So its relevance is something that has reached across the centuries, and it was a critical point in the development of certainly modern history as we understand it. So it's worth going over and investigating its relevance and seeing how it fitted into the history of the time and, of course, subsequently. So I'm going to go back a little bit in time here. The British Empire really came, and Britain became, if you like, the world's superpower, or certainly sharing superpower status with France at the time. But and it became a world power in 1756 to 1763 in the 7 Years' War. Now, the British already had a very substantial trading network that they were doing quite well out in the Caribbean, in the Americas, in Asia and the Indian subcontinent, and so on. So they were pretty active all around the place, and their receipts for trade and duties and so on were considerable, which made them one of the richest nations in the world at the time, certainly from a trading perspective. So in the 7 Years' War, they pretty much cleared most of North America, other than the Louisiana sort of area. Cleared most of North America of French influence, or certainly military French influence, and also cleared the Dutch out of North America as well, and New York and so on. So that set off a chain of events in North America, where the British still stationed forces there and a naval squadron there, and they wanted to somehow pay for the upkeep of those forces, armed forces, and the squadron. So they levied the tax on on the British colonists living in America, and the colonists, not unreasonably, said, "Well, hey, look, we'd like a say in all this if we're going to have to pay taxes to cover the cost of it." And again, not unreasonable, but. And with the French threat gone, the colonists quite reasonably argued that, well, there are no immediate threats, so why should we have to pay for defences that we're really not going to use? And that led sort of gradually to what effect was a civil war. It's later was called the War of Independence, but in effect it was a civil war, and it was a kind of a strange war because neither side really wanted war. They kind of lurched towards it one step at a time, and then a little bit into it, the colonists were kind of ready to give up. They thought, gee, we're not really getting anywhere here. Now, the British had a bit of a problem, was that the French had a decent sized fleet in European waters, and they also had quite a large standing army. So the British were obliged to keep their best quality forces in the home waters around Britain in case the French got up to no good. And also there was a lot of competition in the Caribbean, so they had to keep a separate squadron there. So they had in the overall scheme of things, really not such a large naval presence in North America as they could have done had they wanted to. But because of these other commitments, but nonetheless, the war wasn't going well for the colonists, and they were going to throw in the towel. But the French, realizing that if they didn't intervene, and their sole purpose wasn't to help the colonists, it was to embarrass Britain. But France was in pretty bad shape financially, and they really couldn't afford to give the sort of help that they did, which was quite a large naval fleet, and with some of their best officers and crews. Also, in the siege of Yorktown, all the siege guns and all the heavy cannons and all the siege troops that we used were French. So the reality is, had the French not intervened, it's probably that both sides would have probably cut some sort of deal, and things would have gone on. But But the French intervened primarily to embarrass the British, because they were still sore and annoyed about the 7 Years' War, where they got beaten pretty badly. And so so France then sort of lurched. It was on a knife edge financially. It was unable to really recover from that. And then when there were a few bad harvests, and the people got hungry, and the Paris mob, and then you had the French Revolution. Now, from the French Revolution, out came a young artillery officer who just happened to be one of the greatest military geniuses of all time, Napoleon Bonaparte. And he sort of became first consul and later crowned himself as emperor. Not long after becoming emperor, though, he decided that, in fact, about the time of becoming emperor, if not before, he decided that the only way to knock Britain out of the way, knock England out of the way, was to invade. So they had to build a big fleet in conjunction with Spain, and that fleet had to be there to protect the flat-bottomed troop transports to get troops onto England. Now, if the French had got a decent-sized force, even 20,000 men, I think would have been enough, got a decent-sized force onto the ground in England, that they would have won. They were a far better military force at the time, much better led, better organised, better trained, and from an army perspective at least. So they wouldn't have had to get too many guys on the ground there to have successfully invaded England. Now, the English were aware of that, and so they had a very substantial fleet, that was, without doubt, the most proficient fleet in the world in terms of training and gunnery training. The officers were generally much better. The ships weren't necessarily better in design than anything the French had, but the officer class were generally much better. And as I say, the gunnery and the ordnance and so on were superior most of the time. So the fleet, the French and Spanish fleet, was assembling off the coast of Spain, near Cape Trafalgar, and the British, of course, were running their fleet to keep them boxed in port. That had a couple of effects. One is, if you can't take your fleet to sea, you can't get the practice, and you can't get the gunnery practice and things you need to have a proficient, effective fighting force. So when the fleet did come out, they outnumbered the British by a decent amount, but they just weren't the same quality. Now, the stakes were very high. Had the French and Spanish prevailed at Trafalgar, and it was by no means a done deal at the outset. If they prevailed, then they would have been able to successfully invade England, and as I say, they would, if they've got a decent force on the beaches, they would have won. So there was a lot hanging on this battle, and so Admiral Nelson was in charge, and he'd lost an eye, he'd lost an arm, and he was quite a slightly built guy, but he was very brave, and he was willing to take risks, and he also had a very sharp eye for the tactical nature of battles, and how to arrange the formation of ships and so on. So the British went into battle there at Trafalgar, and it was a very substantial victory to the British, and they quite reasonably celebrated that for a long time afterwards. And there's a column in what's called Trafalgar Square in London. It's called Nelson's Column, and I think it's well over 100 feet high, and it has his statue at the top, which I guess is too high for the Black Lives Matter people to go up and spray paint it or something. But that's there, and if you go to London, you can go to Trafalgar Square and have a look. And I think it's down in one of the southern docks, I think in Southampton, or down in the south there, the original Victory, the Nelson's flagship. I think it was built in something like 1770, 1765, 1770. It was originally built, and it was re-engineered in part with better masts and rigging and so on, and more cannons, better quality cannons and the like. But it's still, as my understanding, the same ship. In fact, I was on the deck of the Victory a few years ago when I was in England, and the spot where Admiral Nelson was shot by a sniper who was up in the rigging of a French ship. And if you think of all the smoke and all that, I doubt the guy would have known who it was. He probably spotted, well, it looks like a British officer, I think I'll take a pot shot, and happened to at the musket ball having to like go through the shoulder and then down through the middle there, and Nelson died shortly thereafter. And it's rather a grisly story of how they put his body in a barrel of brandy to preserve it, to bring it back to England. So anyway, that was a great success there for one of course many in history for the British Navy. Now, what this did is Napoleon, in effect, gave up the idea of trying to invade England through the Navy, and he then pursued other means. And one of the primary means that he pursued was what was called a continental system, as he called it, where no European country, including Russia, by the way, was allowed to trade with England. And Napoleon, not unreasonably, believed this would put a lot of pressure on England and would cut off their funds, or a lot of their funds that they used to wage war and harass the French and so on. So, and Napoleon putting that system in place meant that the British at that stage, the Industrial Revolution, it was in its early things, but pretty much all the things that the British made, they were well made, they were good quality, certainly compared to what else you get around at the time. And people wanted to buy them. They were well priced, and people wanted them. So there was a huge black market going on and all sorts of smuggling and contraband operations to sell British goods into the continent. But eventually the Russians, Tsar Alexander got sick of Napoleon telling him what to do. He said, no, I'm going to trade with the British. I need to sell Russian grain to the British and in return get or Russian things like pine and those sorts of things, and I need to buy British goods. So Napoleon was incensed by this and decided to invade Russia to teach Tsar Alexander a lesson. And that was the disastrous 1812 campaign into Russia, which really brought about the end of Napoleon after incurring such heavy losses, not only in men but materiel and horses, all that sort of thing. Napoleon wasn't down and out because, again, he was a military genius. It still took some effort to put him away, but that really was the end of the game. He pretty much lost his serious offensive capability and was really on the defensive from that point on. And so, and that was the end of Napoleon. He was put on the island of Elba, which is in the Mediterranean, and then not long after he'd been there, he decided he'd make a comeback, and then, as we all know from history, was defeated only by a knife edge, by the way. It was a very close run thing, but was defeated in Waterloo, which is a village in modern day Belgium. So that's it. But that set the stage. Britain was now the world's preeminent power. There was no real opposition anywhere to Britain. Certainly their naval power was unchallenged. Their navy, roamed the seas, and they could project power pretty much anywhere in the globe that they wanted to. So they still maintained a small army, so they didn't go into the big standing army that the French and later the Germans and the Russians, all those guys did. So, but this set the stage. What was known as the Pax Britannica, as there'd been the Pax Romana. Pax Britannica was the peace of the world. So there were some conflicts, for example, the Crimean War in the mid 1850s, but they were smaller and regional conflicts, not involving the massed armies of the Napoleonic era, nothing like the massed armies that would occur in, for example, World War One. So that peace, the peace at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, that peace lasted pretty much uninterrupted for almost 100 years, and the British there were to maintain that peace and police the oceans, project power they needed to finger wag those that were straying from the straight and narrow. So the Battle of Trafalgar actually has huge relevance and ramifications on a much wider stage and over a longer time frame. So it's worth. And these historical things aren't really taught anymore, but it's certainly worth knowing its relevance and its context in history. So I hope that's given people a few things to think about. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.